Hi, friends, and welcome again to Searching for Answers, the program where we take God's Word in our trembling fingers, humbly and respectfully and reverently, open it up and read and think together, asking ourselves the question, what did it mean when it was first written, and what does it mean in our lives today? Participants, above all, the most important, include you. You are the most important. But at the same time, as our discussants here, we include Dr. Bernard Taylor, an Old Testament scholar who knows a whole lot about the New Testament, and Dr. Leo Rancelin, a New Testament scholar who knows a whole bunch about the Old Testament. We're glad they're both on hand. My name is John Jones, La Sierra University, and we'll get started. It's been some years now, something like a couple of decades that this program's been going. But over that period of time, we have almost entirely made this a New Testament experience. A while back, we did a bit with Ruth, didn't we? And a bit with Esther as well. But for the most part, it's been New Testament. At this point, we are opening up a new series on an Old Testament book, the famous but short little book of Amos, as his name would have been pronounced, but we pronounce it Amos, and that'll do. Amos is one of those 12 so-called minor prophets that are clumped together at the close of your Old Testament. They each have unique personalities. They each symbolize an emerging new direction in the life, work, and ministry of the prophets. They are fascinating to read, but the first one historically, we think, was Amos. So we'll start with him, where did he live and when? Tell us something about this interesting character, Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, Amos, well, first of all, let's start from the beginning, as it were, not Genesis. But at this time, what is today the state of Israel was divided geographically into two sections. Down below was Judah, and above was Israel. Amos lived in Judah, but his ministry is entirely to the northern kingdom, and he has a message that the Lord has laid on his heart. So we are towards the middle of the 8th century, in the 700s,
yeah.
And that's a long time ago. So that's 2,700 years roughly. But important things were happening back then as well. So, as was noted, Amos is called a prophet. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 3, it records that there was a change in name for the office. They used to be called a roer, one who sees. Now, if you could put 3 E's in a row in the English language, but if you hyphenate it as a seer, and then that becomes abbreviated into a seer, one who sees. And then they were called a navi, a prophet. We don't know the origin of that word, but that's the name that still persists at the time of Amos and through all of the other prophets, all the way down to Malachi. And the minor prophets, incidentally, originally meant small. The 12 little prophets would have fitted onto one scroll.
Yeah.
So you have the big 3, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then you have the 12 little ones. Now, in some texts, like in the Greek translation, the minor prophets precede the major prophets because many of them did that anyway.
Yeah, in fact, Isaiah apparently came along after Amos.
Yes, contemporaneous with Micah.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So that's the rough time frame. The nations to be noted are Assyria. This is, their capital was Nineveh, and you likely know of Nineveh from the Jonah story.
Yeah.
Then closer down was Syria. Now, a little bit of forethought would have made English a lot easier if we had two names that weren't so close together. But then on the other hand, on the nightly news, you often see Damascus as the capital of Syria, still to this day. And then down the other side, you have Egypt, down through what today is Israel or Palestine. And these were the powers then. Babylon had not yet come to prominence, but it's a few centuries down the road and it will come into play.
Yeah, good sketch, an interesting background. You've touched on several things that we will continue to unpack as we go through the text. Maybe for the moment it's just enough to say that Amos doesn't see himself as a roé, a seer. He doesn't use that word.
Yes.
He does use the word navi, but only to deny it to himself and to say, well, I am not one of those people either, which leaves us with an interesting question. Well, what is he?
Right.
Who is he, and how does he understand his role and function?
Right.
And we won't try to answer that in any detail at the moment, but what strikes you, Leo, as you go through this material?
If I could just add a thing or two here to what Dr. Taylor said in terms of the historical cultural background, and that is, indeed, this is from the 8th century. Amos typically gets dated 760, 750. And this is a time of economic prosperity and military might on the part of the northern kingdom of Israel. And the reason for that is that Assyria and Egypt are not able to rest and control Palestine at this time. And so there's on the whole, a good deal of independence on the part of Israel under Jeroboam II and Uzziah and Judah in the south.
And active trading routes.
Exactly. And so they controlled what we call the King's Highway here, which was a very important trading route that brought a great deal of merchandise and prosperity and economic well-being to the northern kingdom of Israel. So
hey, everything's fine. We're great. We're prospering.
Exactly.
Look, it's all great. We've got a brand new house and a 3-car garage with fancy cars in it, or whatever, you know.
And a summer house as well.
Yeah, and a summer house as well. Yeah. Oh, ouch. It's hard to go with a message like he had to people in that condition, in those days or in our day, isn't it?
So we have a group of people becoming quite wealthy and rich, especially the royal house and some of the merchants. And unfortunately, that wealth is not being distributed to a good segment of society.
Okay, we're going to have to...
Especially the destitute and the poor.
Right. We're really going to have to...
And Amos is quite bothered by that, as we're going to see when we read through
He should be, right.
But in terms of the prophet, we don't know much about him except what we see in chapter 1 there, in chapter 7. He was a shepherd. He was a herdsman. He was a dresser of sycamore figs. Looks like
humble
shepherd, farmer. But when you read the scholarly literature, there's a debate as to his social economic status. Some think he was poor and bothered by the wealth. Others argue that he may have had some property and controlled some sheep and cattle and may not have been as destitute as we have thought. But I think he was among the poor of society. And then, of course, the issue of him was he part of the prophetic guild? It doesn't look like it. Looks like he was just a shepherd farmer, and Yahweh called him from Tekoa, go north. I have some words I want you to share with the northern kingdom of Israel.
Classically, we've had a tendency to say that the priests in the temple were the ones who were aligned with the political powers of the day. They were the ones who kind of supported the king and the king's court and gave prophecies or at least conducted the rituals, let us say. And the ceremonies, they were in charge of all of that. We have also had a tendency to say that the prophets actually were cut out of very different cloth. We think of John the Baptist living in animal skins out in the desert and kind just living on whatever he can scramble up there, and occasionally blowing in on a hot desert wind, needing a shower and shave, and shaking his finger at the priests as well as the rulers. But apparently the idea of a prophet can also occupy middle ground, which maybe sometimes had some stringent things to say, but could also be prostituted, may I use that language? In somehow kind of getting caught up in the political powers of the day and prophesying success for whatever scheme the elite and the rulers cook up and so forth. Somehow, maybe that's why Amos doesn't like that role for himself either. So he's a prophet. He's one of the little prophets. Jewish history has always included him and happily put that title upon him. But he conceives of his prophetic role in a little different way, doesn't he? From the kind of standard sort of standoff that we have here between priests on the one side and prophets on the other. Apparently, the schools of the prophets could include training in chanting chants, composing and reciting poetry, music, trances. We're not sure what all's going on there. Some kind of a charismatic thing, some kind of a charismatic thing that you could work up and bring upon yourself. And that seems to be part of what Amos is rejecting. He says, no, if that's what prophet means, count me out, in a way, doesn't he?
Yeah, and many of these were professional prophets.
That's their livelihood.
Yes, this was their life work. They were paid for it. And
there's already a problem in that, isn't
there's always a problem in that. And so, right from the outset, Amos stands apart from this. Just a quick, slightly bigger context. We say that Amos, and the evidence is that Amos was the first, so who was second? And in the second half of that 8th century, we have Hosea, who overlapped part of the time of Amos, but went further down and overlapped with a number of kings from a later period of time. And this book bursts forth in full academic bloom. It is a challenge in the Hebrew as in English. It is a literary masterpiece. It is a complete piece of work, and in my second year of Hebrew, we read 4 of the minor prophets, and Amos was first. Amos, Hosea, Joel, and Micah were the 4 that we read. And if you're wondering, why are we bothering with the Old Testament? You really need to stay tuned, because the issues then are front and central in 2018 in the 21st century.
They really are.
They really are. And the picture of God that unfolds beginning in the first few verses and the first 2 chapters hit me between the eyes. I had never heard of this message, and I wish that I had known of it earlier. How compassionate God is, and the extent to which, and the way he finally crafted the message that was delivered to the people. But we'll come to that shortly. But don't prejudge. Don't prejudge Amos.
Yes, good advice.
We will deal as we go along with a lot of the prejudices that you, as we grew up with, but in a careful study of the Old Testament, don't prove to be the case.
Exactly so. And another reason, very valid reason, for spending some time with Amos and his ilk, these other minor prophets, is that Jesus in some way consciously aligns himself
Right.
with this prophetic voice,
Right.
these people. Prophecy is turning a corner in a way, isn't it?
Yes.
With these prophets, a new perspective on things. And Jesus is deliberately aligning himself with this when he says, for example, if you knew what it meant that God desires mercy, not sacrifice, for example, he is right in line with these.
Right.
So we do need to do our homework a little on this, don't we? So,
Romans chapter 1 seems to be crafted on the first
yeah,
2 verses by Paul. And you see,
yeah,
the better we understand the Old Testament, the better we understand the New.
yeah,
And it's fascinating as we read this to be conscious of what's being said and how it's being said, and to wonder how the message from such geographically distant places got to be recorded here.
Yeah, long ago and far away, but human nature is the link, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So apparently, not every word of this has to be attributed directly to Amos. We'll get into that as we go along. But we may start even with the opening verse. The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw, that's an interesting matter we need to look at, concerning Israel in the days of King Uzziah of Judah, in the days of King Jeroboam, that's Jeroboam the second, son of Joash of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. We cannot identify that earthquake.
Right.
So it doesn't help us with the dating at all. But as you say, Leo, this is about, middle of the 700s, somewhere there. Remember, a reminder to our viewers, we're counting backwards here toward Christ as time goes on. So here we are, the words of Amos. Many of these prophets start off with the word of the Lord. Well, this is a word of the Lord, but here it's given through Amos. It's presented as given through Amos, yeah. And he's among the shepherds.
Right.
Yeah. We can identify the rule of these kings. They overlap. The two kings are almost coterminous in their time. And once we have that opening caption in verse 1, we get right into the Lord roaring from Zion. Now, there's a little oddity here. It's the words of Amos which we would expect the verb heard.
Yes.
And here it says he saw.
Yeah.
It is the case of these 9 chapters that the last couple, 3 chapters are vision.
Right.
So they are things that he saw. Any further thoughts on that? What is the word in the Hebrew? Is it
Davar?
davar?
Yes.
Which can also mean something like the message or even the concern.
Yes.
Can't it?
And the beginning of Jeremiah is similar, except there it is singular, and this is plural.
Yeah.
I don't think that this would cause anybody any concern at the time.
Yeah.
But it does appear to us. So you hear words, you don't see them, although prophets like Amos had insights.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
whether that's, I'm inclined to think that's our perspective, but at the same time, the hearer would not be unaware of the fact that these are words that were seen and not heard.
I think, in a way, we're reminded that that prophecy comes as impressions, convictions, insights from on high, but that the prophet has some freedom as to how he shall express. And that's apparently what's at work here.
Yeah, and you mentioned that later on there are 4 visions recounted in the first person where Amos is recounting what he saw.
Yeah.
And but that doesn't necessarily cover everything else.
Yeah.
And I think necessarily doesn't cover everything else. Now, as we get into this, you will discover, and if you have a modern translation of the Bible, you will find that Amos and these minor prophets are in poetry, and the original is in poetry too. And in this connection, we perhaps should add another thing that is easy to take for granted, but it's our Old Testament is a translation of the Hebrew Bible. Almost all of it is in Hebrew. There's just a section in the book of Ezra and a larger section in the book of Daniel, and all the rest is in Hebrew. It's a Semitic language. It's not an Indo-European like Greek and Latin and English and German and all of those other languages. This is a different culture. This is a different way of giving expression. However, every language is adequate to express the thoughts of the speakers of the language because they're free to change it.
Exactly.
However they do it, whether by adopting other words from other languages or whatever it may be. So this is not, the language is not in any sense inadequate, although there is not the range of nuancing that we are accustomed to in English. You know, 16 volumes of the Oxford English Dictionary.
Yes.
There's just a plethora of words and
English has too many words.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
And so this has to be translated.
Yeah. So, but in so doing, we can translate it up or translate it down, so to speak, a little bit, can't we?
Yes.
So here we are. Verse 2 may be just a kind of a way of getting us into the indictments of these other civilizations that follow through chapters 1 and 2.
If I could just make a comment before then.
Yeah.
It begins in the Hebrew Divrei Amos, the words of Amos.
Yeah.
And then we hear that he is amongst the shepherds, as has been said. Normally at this stage, you would have a patronymy. You would learn of who his father was. There is very little about Amos. And when...
we know his father was not a prophet.
Yes, right, that's it. And you see, that's all we know. No mention of Amos anywhere else in the Old Testament. And that's the reason, as Leo was doing, that we read the text so carefully, because that's all we have.
Yeah.
We don't want to overread it, but we don't want to miss anything.
That's right.
And it doesn't necessarily follow that because there is no father mentioned. Elijah's father is not mentioned, for instance.
Yeah, so the standard form would be Amos, son of whoever, right? But we don't have that.
Yes.
I don't know. That makes me think he's from the lower echelons of society, Leo. What do you think?
A farmer,
Yeah.
You know, you were talking about the experience of the prophet with Yahweh. We can press the text as far as we can, but then there's a mystical dimension to that that we just can't seem to quite grasp as fully. You know, I think of the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach good news. So there's quoting the prophets, of course, and that's a prophetic experience that the prophets had with Yahweh. But whatever we can say about that experience, they were quite convicted that what they were sharing were the words of the Lord. Yeah.
Even when the Lord roars, as we have here in the very next verse. So Leo, as the final moments tick down here, take us through just that verse 2 as a kind of an umbrella over all that follows.
It's kind of a synopsis or a
Yeah.
thesis of the whole book, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds, my NRSV has withered, but I think other translations have mourn. And the top of Carmel dries up.
The highest mountain in the area had
Yeah.
snow in the wintertime. But here is a trembling kind of, withering, withdrawing at the sound of the mighty voice. So this is not introduced in a trivial way.
No.
The point is that, hey, God's speaking here.
Right.
And, anything else in that verse that we should
graphic imagery here of the lion, and Dr. Taylor alluded to this being poetry. And what do we do with this image of Yahweh as a lion roaring? And we're going to see this imagery of the lion in chapter 3,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Verse 4. Does a lion roar in the forest when it has no prey? And then a young lion.
And that actually marks the end of this section. A
Right.
lion roaring at the beginning and a lion roaring at the end.
Right, 3:8. The lion has roared. So
Yeah.
Yahweh is roaring. And typically when lions roar, they're looking for prey.
Yeah.
And that's a striking and graphic image of Yahweh here.
So we better take it seriously.
For sure.
2,700 years ago and now.
And his impact upon nature is quite devastating, right?
Yeah.
As you said, the top of Carmel dries up and the pastures.
Yeah.
The
wither.
first three words here are interesting because in English you can't detect it because the words have to be put in English order. Normally a Hebrew sentence begins with the verb.
The verb.
Then the subject follows, and then the object after that. There are exceptions, but here it begins with Yahweh,
Oh.
the divine name. Yahweh from Zion
Right.
roars, not from Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, but here is a message from the south.
Yeah.
And from Jerusalem, he thunders his voice. The verb is not of that nature, but the verb, the noun kol, is first of all the sound of animals and a loud sound of the animals. And so it matches the roar of the lion.
Okay. Yeah.
Next time, we will need to talk some about the nature of poetry, which, Hebrew poetry. We're just getting into it here.
Yes.
But there
the
is
cadences, even in translation, those measured cadences, the solemnity of it comes through, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here we are. We ask what the text meant as a way of getting at its meaning for us today. That includes looking at the background. And while we will not always be obsessed with that, we will constantly touch back on it as we continue through this fascinating book of Amos. Each time as we meet together, we'll look forward to meeting with you next time on Searching for Answers.